morning, everyone.
Morning.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. All right, so a few things I think for our introduction. Again, my name is David, and it's my colleague Veronica. We work for a large company in the architecture, engineering, and construction and planning space. So a lot of different spaces that we work in called AECOM. Curious who has heard of AECOM or worked with AECOM? Okay. Oh, that's more than I was expecting. Has anyone actually worked for, like, been an employee of AECOM before? Okay, so just we'll give a background on the company in general. It's impressive that so many people have heard of the company. But first, so it'll be about us, then we're going to go through trends in the industry, what we're seeing and what we're thinking in this future mobility space, followed by project delivery, what we're actually doing. So we'll give some case studies on projects locally and around the globe, and then ultimately conclude with this ecosystem that we're envisioning, because there's many different types of companies and services that are going to be a part of the future of mobility. Actually, one more question for the audience. Anyone involved in getting people or goods from point A to point B? Okay, a few people. So that's, in general, that's sort of the broadest definition that we can give to transportation. As way of background for the company, AECOM, our tagline is design, build, finance, and operate. Here are some big numbers. We're on the order of between $17 and $18 billion of revenue in any given year. We're on 7 continents, close to 90,000 employees, many different countries. Here's our market. So on the left, you can see the various markets that we operate in. A lot of which are, so Veronica and I both coming from the transportation market, but as a company, you can talk to people that have specialties in many different industries. And we have that full capability to design, build, finance, and operate given projects. And we have recently, within the this next slide will show it, this is our history since going public with our original IPO in 2007. So we just celebrated our 10-year IPO anniversary. The company has grown organically, but also has acquired a lot of firms along the way. Veronica and I can speak to that personally. We're both from URS, which you see on the slide here in 2014. That was a very large merger with URS at 55,000 people at the time, which brought the numbers up significantly for AECOM. But Hunt and Tishman are 2 construction companies that you may have heard of as well. Our latest acquisition was with Shimmick, and they are a corridor transportation construction firm. So we really, under one roof, have a lot of these services to implement the ideas that we're going to be talking about today. And Veronica, you want to go give an introduction to AECOM Ventures?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is my great pleasure to be in Pasadena because I live 8 minutes away, so it was a really fantastic morning for me. So a little bit about AECOM Ventures. So David and I are transportation planners, both based here in LA, and probably around 3 years ago, we started a small group in LA called New Ventures that was looking at innovations coming up in our industry. And there were quite a bit. We just kind of put them on a whiteboard. They ranged from Hyperloop to connected and autonomous vehicles to breweries, because there were a lot of breweries starting up in LA at the time. Startups, tech firms, and trying to see where these new innovations were going to intersect with what we do. Some of them, we did extensive research, for example, on breweries. Turns out, like, they don't need a lot of services from a giant engineering company. It was really good. Like, we did really good due diligence on that one, but whatever. But some of them stuck. And so at the time, for example, Hyperloop, we had been working on the California high-speed rail project and had a lot of people in our company that had been working on traditional rail projects. And when we brought up Hyperloop, they were like laughing at us. That's not going to happen. Cars aren't going to drive themselves. But slowly but surely, these things are now real, and we're here today talking about autonomous vehicles, and there are autonomous vehicles on the road in our country right now. So the company realized that these technologies and innovations are really going to completely upend the way we do business. And so now there's a group within our company called AECOM Ventures, which I'm a part of. It's a corporate level group, so working across the entire globe. really focused on what are the innovations within our industry, and my particular focus is transportation. So within that, there are a couple initiatives we're focused on right now that we'll talk about today. Electric vehicle infrastructure, Hyperloop, we won't talk about a ton today, but happy to answer any questions on that. And then one of the focuses of our chat today, connected and automated vehicles. So just to get started, I know we have people from very diverse backgrounds here, so we want to start kind of with an overview of what the trends that we're seeing in the transportation industry. And broadly speaking, I'll touch upon the regulations and policies that are ongoing now and being developed here in the United States. I'll also speak to connected and autonomous vehicles, and then I'll turn it back to David to talk about shared mobility and electric vehicle infrastructure. So a lot going on at the federal level right now. Hopefully this doesn't bore you, but if you're interested in policy and the regulatory context, hopefully it'll be a little bit interesting. So most of these were enacted under our previous administration, but some of them are ongoing now. So the United States Department of Transportation has released vehicle-to-vehicle communication guidelines that say by 2023, all light-duty vehicles are going to need to be able to communicate with one another. So right now, your vehicle may be giving you prompts about traffic and things like that. By 2023, all new light vehicles will be able to talk to one another and say, hey, I'm coming up, hey, I'm planning on crossing this intersection. Not only are they going to be required to have those communication technologies, they'll have to speak the same language as the terminology that DOT used, which means essentially Volvo is going to have to talk to Ford and Chevy and whatever other cars are on the road of the day. So we'll have kind of a comprehensive ecosystem of vehicles speaking to one another by 2023. Yeah.
Is there a standard convention of language that they're thinking about using, or anything's fair game right now?
There are. So we've had, this is new regulatory guidance, but there are, we have had, for the past couple of decades, a field called intelligent transportation systems, and so there are standards within that. But in terms of the language, that's probably going to develop out of the existing ITS protocols. The next one is the AV policy guidelines, also from the federal government. This document is essentially providing guidance to the states and local jurisdictions who want to do anything around connected and autonomous vehicles. It defines those terms because we have a lot of localities doing different policy work and using different terminology. It provides guidance on what are the behavioral competencies. So what do vehicles do now with human drivers, and what are we going to want them to do if they're connected and autonomous? And it provides technical assistance to states and localities. It's a really informative document, so if you're interested in this field and interested in getting into this field, I think that's a good place to start. The next is the vehicle to infrastructure communication guidelines, also from the federal government. And basically this defines what counts as a vehicle speaking to infrastructure. So what counts as a vehicle speaking to a street light or an intersection. And this is notable because it sets the standards for projects that would be eligible for federal funding. So for example, if we want to move forward with implementing something here in Pasadena, if we want to get federal funding for vehicle to infrastructure communication, it has to comply with this document. And then finally, on the federal level, the Self-Drive Act, which is an insane acronym that I will tell you in the Q&A when I look it up on my phone when David's talking. But it's a crazy town acronym. They didn't need to make it like that, but they did. But in any case, it passed the House unanimously, which I think, knowing how dysfunctional things are in DC right now, hopefully I'm not offending anyone, but knowing the difficulties we've had in getting legislation passed, the fact that this passed unanimously is really noteworthy. So it passed the House, it's going to the Senate, and it outlines the levels of autonomous vehicle deployment that can be done in the United States, and the permitting process and things like that. So this is a big deal because, as we know now, the private companies are just kind of going rogue and putting their vehicles out on the road, and there's really no context within which for them to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, so is there a ballpark number? So if somebody had something really great and they have to go through this process, what it would cost? Is it like millions, billions, or?
Real quick, we'll save the Q&A for later, but if you'd like to repeat the question before answering it, that'd be great.
The question was whether there was a ballpark number for...
Yeah, for actual implementation.
Right.
And I think it would depend on the state of the technology and the product that you would have right now, because you're gonna have to meet federal guidelines for safety and regulation like these cars do. So I think, unfortunately, it may be an unsatisfying answer. It would be a project or company specific answer
got
for
it.
that, depending on the state of the technology already.
Okay. And then moving down to the state level, you can see we have what is fondly referred to as a patchwork right now of regulations across the states. So some states have enacted regulations, some haven't, some have governors that have signed executive orders. All of them set different insurance requirements. All of them define connected and autonomous in a slightly different way. So this is a cause of a lot of frustration on the private industry side, because if you're an automaker or you're a technology firm, you don't want to have to comply with different standards once you cross the state line. So that is why the House took action with the federal legislation, not passed by the Senate yet. But even though we do have this patchwork situation right now, many states are moving forward with pilot projects, implementations, demonstrations. Here in California, our state legislature instructed the DMV to enact guidelines, and so we're one of the states that has a pretty stringent, I think, regulatory context. We have identified locations within the state where connected and autonomous vehicle testing can occur. Companies that are doing that testing need to get a permit from the DMV. You can go onto the DMV website right now and see all of the companies that have permits. You can see all of their safety records. So it's a pretty transparent, but maybe unsurprisingly, kind of heavy regulatory environment here in California. Just to give a little bit of overview on what we're talking about before we get into some of the case studies that David's going to talk about. So there's the connected part and there's the automated part, and we sometimes put them together, but really they're a little bit distinct. So for the connected vehicles, it really means, as I mentioned before, vehicles communicating with other vehicles, vehicles communicating with infrastructure, and then the final level of that is vehicles communicating to every other road user. So if I'm biking down on the bike share in Pasadena and there's a bus coming, I get a notice that the bus is coming, and the bus gets a notice that there's a cyclist there. Then there are 5 levels of autonomy, ranging from human controlled everything to completely driverless. A lot of the vehicles we have on the road right now today have some level in between. So they have the vehicle communicating to the driver in terms of safety, in terms of traffic and things like that, but it's still up to the driver to then take that information and make a behavioral action. The next level is for the vehicle to actually do that action automatically. So the vehicle tells you you're veering out of the lane. Right now it's up to us to get back into that lane. The next level is that the vehicle would actually put you back into that lane. And then the final level is you're just taking a nap in the back seat.
Nice.
Yes, I know. In terms of what this means, I mean, that sounds great for us to be taking a nap in the back seat. But if we think about it, if we think about everybody potentially taking the value of their time in the car and realizing that we can work in there or nap in there, it could have really tremendous impacts on congestion. So the policies and regulations of how we roll these out really matter in terms of whether we get a really congested future with an explosion of trips, or more sharing of vehicle use, less vehicles on the road, and a better environment for walking and biking. So the estimates on how this might go are really incredibly varied. Ford says that they'll have a fully autonomous vehicle on the roads by 2021. However, other research done, for example, by the Victoria Policy Institute, they looked at rates of adoption of different policies and different innovations in transportation, and they say it's probably about 40 years until we get significant vehicle fleet turnover. So even if you have a couple autonomous Fords on the road, you don't really get the benefits of reducing parking or making lane width smaller or tremendous increases in safety if you still have a bunch of human drivers around that vehicle. So it will take some time for fleet conversion, and related, it'll take some time for us to realize some of the benefits that we can get from these technologies. One of the things that's pretty clear is that we will have accident reduction and increases in safety. So the USDOT, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, says that over 90% of the crashes we have on the road today are caused by human error. And so these technologies will really help reduce that, saving potentially up to $190 billion by 2050. Potentially saving time in our commutes because vehicles will operate more efficiently and won't be so delayed. and potentially saving over 2,000 square miles of parking. Because if vehicles are circulating, they can park closer to one another. We could reduce the amount of space we have, especially in kind of very high value areas that are dedicated to parking. Like I said, the estimates in terms of what this might do to congestion on the road are also really varied and really dependent on how we roll these vehicles out. So some research says that we'll have 80% less cars on the road. But other research, again, from Victoria Transportation Policy Institute and International Transport Policy, says that, if we all decide, hey, like, I'm here giving this presentation, but my car can go out and get my dry cleaning, or my car can go out and get my groceries, or I can send my pet to the vet without a driver, or older adults or persons with disability who can't drive can now ride, and children can now ride without a driver. That opens up an entire new realm of trips, of vehicles driving around completely unoccupied, which can cause tremendous congestion and increase in mileage on the road and deterioration of the road. So that, we both kind of come from a transit, public transportation background. So that is I think one of the main concerns for all of us in the industry in terms of rolling out these technologies. So that's connected and automated. I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about the two other transportation technology trends, shared and electric.
All right, a quick story about automated vehicles and this idea of accident reduction. Did people see just 2 days ago in Las Vegas the headlines on that automated shuttle? And it was like, automated shuttle crashes within 2 hours of implementation in Las Vegas, right? And what happened was the vehicle, the automated shuttle, was driving down the road. A truck in front of it was backing up, like a trailer truck, didn't see the vehicle and like lightly grazed its fender, right? And like no one was injured, no one was close to being injured. And of course, but the headlines read a little differently. But I think the city countered with a great and accurate thought that if the truck had had similar technology, it wouldn't have happened in the first place. So that gets to this idea that Veronica mentioned. We could have a few vehicles out in the very beginning, but we won't really get the benefit until you get large fleet conversion or adoption. So that's a real world example of how rolling out this technology to more vehicles could prevent accidents in the future. So when it comes to shared, I think shared, it really takes a high-level approach, and it's sort of the top of the future, depending on when we talk about congestion and what our roadways are going to look like and how we're going to get around in the future. The level to which we share is going to have profound implications, because, again, if it goes back to the number of vehicles on the road, if everyone in here owned an individual vehicle, guess what? They're all sitting parked somewhere right now. A vehicle sits parked 95% of its lifetime. It's a huge inefficiency. When it's being driven with just one driver, which 75% of daily commutes in the U.S. are one driver, that's a 20 to 25% occupancy rate. So there's a lot of inefficiency for a solo car, like a privately owned vehicle. So the concept of sharing, which can vary all the way down to carpooling up to traditional transportation like subways, is going to have a big implication. There are a lot of dollars at stake when you talk about just parking alone. Parking is very expensive to build. And so we see firms that are wondering about how the future of parking and the dollars. We see private real estate firms, and we see public city agencies that are responsible for building public parking structures, wondering about allocating their dollars and if it's the right investment to make in the future. Because you're talking about easily tens of millions of dollars for parking structures. So in that all, it goes back to the car ownership model. We've obviously seen the rise of Uber and Lyft and the adoption rates that those have with varying industries and various demographics. One key distinction I heard earlier this year, the chief financial officer for GM was talking about the trends of car purchases with millennials, and he said it's actually their fastest growing segment, percentage-wise. Now, actual whole numbers, it's still a smaller percentage than the rest of their segment, But I think that was an interesting stat that they picked up on and may tend to skew or change what we think the vehicle ownership model will be in the future. So it's just something to be aware of, tracking car ownership and car purchases. We also get into this concept of multimodal transportation, the bike share network. This is a picture of Metro's bike share locally here in LA. It's in Pasadena. I know it is receiving some pretty wide range adoption, and people are liking it more. Metro is rolling out more stations. Who's ridden it? Anyone ridden the Metro bike share? Okay, that's good. And then rideshare. This shuttle on the far right, this picture, this is an autonomous shuttle by a company called Easy Mile. And it is a level 4, going back to thinking about that chart of levels of autonomy. It's a level 4, meaning that no human driver is required, but it operates within a certain geo-fenced area. So it has a very detailed, it does a very detailed mapping exercise of where it's going to operate first, and then it's restricted to operating within that zone. It's similar. This is similar to the shuttle that was in Las Vegas. There are several firms right now that have these out in either demonstration projects or actually rolling out live for legitimate transportation, what we call revenue service transportation operations. Typically short distance, half mile, 1 mile, 2 mile kind of loops or corridors that they'll operate back and forth within. But all of these various modes of transportation and technologies are shaping the ecosystem of what we see happening right now. Transitioning into electric vehicles, because we think a lot of the vehicles of the future, especially the automated vehicles, a huge percentage are going to be electric. Here's a chart showing the trends, and it looks great, right? It's going up dramatically. Percentage growth year over year is fantastic. Not sure if you can see it from everywhere in the room. However, that last number represents total electric vehicles purchased as far as like the fleet, the worldwide fleet, 0.86%. So, you have to look at the actual whole numbers as opposed to just growth rates with percentages. But it suffice to say, like, it's growing and it's here. We've had some decision points within the space, if you will. One of them being Volkswagen and the Dieselgate scandal. There's a lot of money being set aside from that and for alternative fuels, and a huge percentage of those alternative fuels are electricity. So you see OEMs are making public statements about the future of their vehicles. So you have a combination of OEMs like Volvo has made an announcement a couple months ago now. Any new model that they bring to market will at least be hybrid, if not fully electric. That's about an 8 to 9 year adoption, you know what I mean, like a transition based on how often they bring new models to market. They were the first large OEM to make that announcement. You obviously have companies like Tesla that are purely electric to begin with, other smaller firms as well, but the big players are also thinking about electric making up a large percentage of their portfolio. You also have policy and public government making announcements. India, Sweden, the City of London, Paris have all made announcements to either stop new sales of internal combustion engines or simply, if you will, outlaw them at some years in the future, either 2030 or 2040, depending on their own benchmark. But they're making strong statements about internal combustion engines. So we definitely feel that they're a large segment of this of the upcoming trend in technology. Specifically looking at bus technology, electric buses. There are several main manufacturers of electric buses. We're seeing that becoming more widely adopted across the industry. To give you some context, 98% of electric buses are sold in China. So they have obviously the strong market lead on that as far as wanting electric buses. Locally, LA Metro, the LA County Transportation Authority, recently made an announcement that by 2030 they're going to transition their entire fleet to electric buses. That's going to start soon and roll up to actually be fully converted or transition, I should say, by 2030. That's a big deal. Antelope Valley, just north of us, they have plans just for next year to have a large percentage of their fleet, if not all of their fleet, fully transition to electric buses. Let's move on. So that was sort of our trends in all those spaces. We can move on to project delivery, actually show you some real world projects that we're working on. Veronica will take the readiness policy plan, I'll take infrastructure, and we'll go from there.
Yep. Cool. Okay, so given that there are all these trends happening in the industry, what are local governments doing, what are consulting firms doing, and what are tech firms doing? So that's kind of what we're going to go over now in 10 minutes. So this is a project in Tennessee. We're working with the Department of Transportation. So I met with the head of the Department of Transportation. This is going to be a downer. I'm serious. He gets an email every time there's a fatality on the road, on the highway network in Tennessee. So it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable for us to have these technologies that can improve safety and still be having people dying on the road. So this plan for Tennessee Department of Transportation is really looking at safety. They have a lot of rural roads in Tennessee without sidewalks, without lighting, very light on infrastructure. And instead of kind of make these heavy infrastructure investments in striping and sidewalks and lighting, we're trying to see how can we use these connected and automated vehicle technologies to improve safety there. That's one example. We're also working in New Zealand on readiness planning, so looking at the state of their fiber network, the roads, the signage, and seeing what upgrades need to be made for connected and autonomous vehicles. I'll go through these kind of quickly. Dubai is really fun. They already have autonomous shuttles on the road, and following their rollout of the shuttles, they hired us to do the safety protocols and plans, which is like totally crazy because here we would do safety planning for like 10 years before we get anything on the road. They already put them out. They had some, not big incidents, but little incidents. And they're like, I guess we should have a safety plan. So that's what we're working on there. And then Miami, kind of similar to Tennessee, and AV Vision Plan, really looking at what is their transportation network and how are these technologies going to come in to help them move people within Miami.
From the infrastructure side, we have, so I mentioned earlier that we also have a construction arm within AECOM that's pretty large, and so we work with General Motors to design and construct some of their testing facilities. So these are actual private facilities where their testing takes place, and the value in that is that if we build their testing facilities, we get to work with them on lessons learned when it comes to actual requirements out on the public right-of-way. So that's I like that service because it ties to the real-world implications that we're going to have out in our streets. The other space is with some EV manufacturers. They're confidential clients as of now, but we're doing design build services that can range all the way from the factory. So like their production line, this is an example of where a company like AECOM can be involved vertically within this entire conversation. We can have a service at each piece along that vertical integration. And then up next is Minnesota.
Yep, so this also fun. So a lot of the autonomous vehicle testing you see, it's like this beautiful little shuttle and it's in a sunny environment, but over 50% or around 50% of the vehicles on the road in the United States will encounter cold weather conditions, extreme cold weather, so snow and ice. And so if all the testing is happening in sunny locations, we're obviously missing a piece of it. So in Minnesota, we're working with Minnesota Department of Transportation to do a pilot for testing in snow and ice conditions of an autonomous bus. Of the DOT, we had a competition. They selected the company Easy Mile, so we're going to be using their vehicle and their technology to do the testing. That's happening right now. So we're just waiting for some snow. If the snow doesn't come, we're going to make it. And so it's really to see how these vehicles perform in cold weather conditions and upgrade the technology to make sure that they can operate safely in those climates. The next one is a metro project that we worked on several years ago. So Metro was a little bit ahead of its time, looking at bike share, at car share, and ride services as part of the comprehensive public transportation system. So this was about 5 years ago. they got a grant from the United States Department of Transportation to fund these types of services. And so they got a provisional grant agreement, and then they brought us on board because the federal government was saying, we don't believe that bike share and car share and ride share are part of public transportation. And so what we had to do was a needs assessment and operating plan to show that really, if you have these services in place, you help the public transportation system, and you make it an easier choice for somebody to get on a train and know that they're going to have mobility options when they get to the other side. So this, the full funding came in, and the Metro Bike Share that is now being implemented is an outgrowth of this project, and where they're moving forward with actually designing these, what they're calling mobility hubs, that would integrate these services and bring them all together so that people have mobility options.
Electric roadways. This is a I think a really crucial project that we're working on. That picture in the top right, that's a picture from a testing facility up in Utah where we partnered with a technology company to provide, I should say, to develop inductive dynamic wireless charging of electric vehicles. So, and on top of that, that bus has been retrofitted with autonomous technology. So that's about a quarter-mile test loop that it's on right now, and there's actually embedded in the roadway charging coils that was like over a fraction of a second. When the bus passes over that coil, it charges the battery within the bus. So effectively, that bus could drive around until its tires wear out, because it does not need to stop for refueling. It's early stage technology development at the moment. We're working with Colorado and the Colorado DOT to identify feasibility, we're doing a feasibility and site selection study for them to find and identify where this type of technology could be rolled out within Colorado. And so that's where a company like AECOM is involved in actual technology, and then also the planning and implementation. So I'm personally really excited about that technology, because I think you can get the sense that it would allow wide levels of electric vehicle adoption. It would eliminate range anxiety. It would be better for operation, from an operations perspective, for both public transit agencies, transportation network companies. There's a lot of benefit to this. And anyway, one quick tangent. The CEO of ChargePoint, which is a charging infrastructure company, made the comment a little while ago that people want to buy a vehicle that can drive across the country, even though they don't drive across the country. And I think that was a good idea. That it gets to the issue of the electric vehicle adoption rates and the range anxiety that people have. And even though we don't drive more than 40 miles a day, for the 90% of people don't drive for more than 40 miles in a day. We all want a car that can go hundreds of miles. But anyway, sorry, I digress. This is something that we're working on right now. The other picture there on the bottom right was with a partnership with Siemens here locally along the Alameda corridor, just outside the ports of LA and Long Beach. It's an overhead catenary system that electrically charges semi-trucks for a 1 mile stretch of the road. That is beginning its operational testing phase right now. So a truck could get that recharge along that 1 mile stretch of the roadway. And so as we conclude this, we really do think that there is this ecosystem that needs to exist. We're finding a lot of benefit from partnerships, public, private, all of this, from the planning side, the technology side, the policy and regulation side. Truly, all of those entities need to come together to move this industry forward in the best way possible to create the best benefit. As you've seen from our presentation, if we don't have high levels of adoption of some of this technology, the benefits won't be realized. So there's that hurdle to get over that adoption rate. And all of these things work together to get us there. And we'll conclude with this picture. This is from the Wall Street Journal several months ago. And we think it paints a pretty decent example of what at least the suburbs would look like for the future of transportation, the types of vehicles there would be. The only thing missing is that, like an indication of the electric roadway charging those buses and cars. But that is it. I think we'll open it up to questions right now. Here's our contact information. You can feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you guys for that amazing presentation on the future of transportation. I'm really excited about it. I'm an electric car owner myself. Any EV car owners in the audience? Okay, handful, not bad. That's that 1% we're talking about here. But it's just really exciting to see the support that that you guys are providing, because I really feel like it's going to solve a lot of sustainability issues, especially as more and more people are coming to LA and inundating the roadways. I think there's a lot of solutions there. Anyway, we're going to open up to Q&A. John's going to walk around with the mic. If you have a question, raise your hand. If what you're saying does not end in a question, we'll yank the mic away with great pleasure, because this is time for questions, not storytelling or comments. But will you guys hang out with us for a little bit afterwards? Cool. So if you like to share stories, do that all front. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. Where is the conversation in terms of autonomous around liability and insurance? I haven't read much lately, but it seems like a huge problem to solve.
Yeah, the insurance industry is super excited about this because they get a new product to sell. But if you look at the state legislation, I would say more than half of those enacted statutes have requirements for liability, and most of them are in the realm of about $5 million. But the companies that are providing the vehicles need to have insurance and surety bonds. In California, our DMV also requires that for any testing. Additionally, I think the states that have moved a little bit forward with their regulations, because some of them have enacted and revised and had several iterations. Some of the states that have that also have provisions in there that kind of assign liability. So they define what the vehicle is, who the owner of the vehicle is, or who the manufacturer of the vehicle is, and then they note that if you sell that vehicle and somebody makes a modification to it, then the liability goes to that person. So they're really trying to make sure that people do not modify these vehicles, and that the liability is really clearly assigned to the vehicle provider. But it varies. It does vary state by state.
Back here.
You mentioned the state and federal legislation. Is there anything being done at the global level on standardization?
At the global level? Mm-hmm. No, not that I know. There are kind of industry organizations that will bring together all of the various policies and kind of put out guidance documents on model policy and model regulations. But I would say the people that are probably looking at it more globally are actually the manufacturers who are not wanting to manufacture significantly different products for different markets. And they are doing a lot of lobbying to try to get the national regulations as similar as possible.
Back here.
Yeah, I have a question concerning, like, we heard a lot about the technological development of those systems we have, and I see that in a good way coming. I also see the customer is the person that decides, like, which way would I take, and in my opinion, he always takes the fastest way to commute. Do you think that technology will solve the problem that they will choose the fastest, like they will choose the most sustainable system, or do you think that there is policy that has to make an impact, like constructing zones for just autonomous or just electronic vehicles? Where do you see the future there?
Yeah, I don't think technology alone will solve that problem, and I think technology is a tool that we can use, and there are some exciting new developments in those tools that we can use to advance our policy goals. But for example, in terms of influencing how people get around, we didn't talk about this in the presentation, but pricing is something that a lot of jurisdictions and states are looking at in terms of how they would price vehicle trips. You might be aware that currently our transportation infrastructure nationally is funded by the gas tax, and gas tax income has been going down because our vehicles are getting more efficient, but also because people are driving less miles. Here in LA County, we have a sales tax measure that funds a lot of our transportation infrastructure, But one of the concerns is that with connected and autonomous vehicles, people might make these choices that result in way more vehicle miles traveled. And so some states like Minnesota are doing demonstrations on mileage-based pricing, so not based on the gas that you consume, because you're not going to pay so much if you have an electric vehicle, but based on the distance you travel. And then the next level of that that jurisdictions are looking at are occupancy-based pricing. So trying to encourage people to share a ride rather than having the car go alone or having just one person in the car. And so I think those policy and regulatory interventions will need to come into place to influence people's behavior.
Next question right here.
Hi guys, thanks for coming to Innovate Pasadena today. I was reading a recent report on Uber and Lyft and the impacts on mass transit. I think it was maybe in Chicago. I know we've had a drop-off in bus ridership. So can you talk about the intersection of legacy mass transit and kind of micro-transit and shared transit, and whether there's, what that does to the ROI of these big infrastructure investments and how those work together?
Yeah, that's a really good question that transit agencies are trying to deal with right now. There's been a decline in public transit ridership across the country to some degree or another within a given jurisdiction. And some of it is these TNCs coming in and taking transit riders off their network. So we're seeing a movement, and actually, as we speak, LA Metro has a proposal out, a request for proposal for a microtransit pilot project. And microtransit is sort of that shuttle, like that autonomous shuttle, the small shuttles, doing that somewhere a half mile to maybe a 3 mile loop or route within a given spot. We call it first mile, last mile. That is a first mile, last mile, thinking about behavioral, like travel behavior from individuals. That first mile, last mile is kind of a big gap. It's a big reason why people don't ride in many cases. So if you can make that gap more pleasant and the user experience better, people can actually see increases on their transit network. So that's what we're thinking now. That's what the industry is thinking. So that is a way in which these future technologies and these operations like Uber and Lyft can actually coexist and create a better, mutually better transit environment, so that you can get people taking different mode options. Maybe they will take Lyft for a 3 mile ride to feed into a major backbone transportation network like a subway or a bus rapid transit. And so it gives people, it kind of speaks to the shared mobility piece that Veronica talked about, where all these modes come together, and they need to come together at various locations. And so transit agencies are very much asking themselves, how do we do microtransit? How do we engage more riders and get higher ridership? And we're seeing that come out onto the market, if you will, through these various requests for proposals, so that we can actually begin, we as the industry can begin to implement these pilot projects and have a more efficient and hopefully shared transit system soon.
Yeah, I think maybe just a small piece to add. There's a quote I really like from Human Transit, which is a book and a blog. If you like transit, you should check it out. Anyway, it's that technology doesn't change facts with geometry. So in very high dense places, mass transit will be the most efficient way to move large groups of people from point A to point B. A fleet of autonomous vehicles is not going to do it as well as a subway system. But I think there's an opportunity to use these connected and automated vehicles to make other types of transit perform better. So I think we're doing a lot of great stuff here, not we collectively in LA. County are doing a lot of great stuff, learning from the on-demand private technology companies to try to make our buses and our shuttles better, so that people can make that choice to take transit. And there was one other thought I had that has escaped me, so we'll move on to the question.
We normally stop at 9:30 on Q&A, but since there's a lot of really great questions, we can go a little bit longer. If you guys have to leave at 9:30, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to continue on.
So going back to the infrastructure and the continuously charging cars, if we're looking at electricity as the main form of doing that, how are you thinking about structuring that in terms of payment? So right now, obviously, we are funded by the gas tax, but what will be the mechanism that will eventually transition new types of funding sources for transportation?
So in that scenario, in the future, the electric utility providers are going to become the fueling companies of the future. So I think they're taking a serious look at that. There's going to be grid implications for upgrading the grid to make sure that enough power can actually, the grid is strong enough and flexible enough to handle those power demands. It's a really interesting question when you start looking at the power grid and peak demand and supply, and how the peaks are a real challenge for electricity companies. They would like it to be as flat as possible. And there are models and transportation scenarios in which that peak can be leveled. When it comes to funding, payments, that is going to be, I think, a case-by-case basis depending on the geography. Because now you talk about the electric utility being the fueling provider. It's like we have different prices for gasoline from neighborhood to neighborhood, let alone across the country or across the world. So that, from a retail consumer perspective, that's going to be an established price. It might even fluctuate within a given day, I'm sure. In fact, if it's done correctly, it would fluctuate within a given day, just sort of like a toll road. And that will just be part of the pricing program, if you will, for a given vehicle to charge on the network.
Right. Hey, thank you very much for your time. You mentioned vehicle to infrastructure and vehicle to X, which is basically vehicle to anything else. Have you considered the inverse, infrastructure to vehicle, and what that might look like?
Yes, so those arrows should go both ways. So it absolutely is both. So it's the vehicle communicating, for example, to the street light that I'm coming, so street lights might turn on dynamically, whether there's somebody approaching or not, but it's also the other way around. So the street lights communicating to the vehicle that I'm going to turn red, you should start slowing down further back. But it is both ways.
There's a early stage use example case study in Las Vegas with Audi, and it was almost 2 years ago now. They have a red light countdown timer they can display on the dashboard of newer Audi vehicles to communicate how many seconds are left until that red light goes green. They just call that sort of like, I think they have a clever name for it, but it's like waiting information, dwell information. It doesn't really impact how a user is going to drive on the road right now, but like Veronica said, the next phase of that is the infrastructure communicating to the vehicle things like the speed they should be driving at now. Audi has dubbed that the green wave, so that you could catch all green lights across, where you're going to drive down Colorado, for 2 miles, they'll time you correctly. That has great implications for efficiency, no matter what fuel you're using, but then also smoother flow of traffic and hopefully higher throughput on the same right-of-way that we have today.
Time for one last question.
Is AECOM Ventures investing in companies, acquiring companies, or is it just mostly an internal R&D policy effort? And if so, what are you investing in?
So we, the Ventures group is fairly new-ish, a little bit over a year, but basically our CEO set aside a pot of money for us to evaluate innovative ideas that come from within our company. And so some of those are also partnering with technology providers. So we wouldn't, for example, just invest in a company that has nothing to do with our core practice of architecture, engineering, infrastructure. But we do kind of a yearly global challenge. If one of our employees says, hey, we should take this technology and do something proprietary with it and apply it to this business case that is part of what we do, then we will invest in that idea. We will invest in the team, our internal team, to develop that idea, and then also give them money to partner with the technology company if they need to do that.